Boom. Okay, so Julie, welcome to the Climate Careers Podcast. We're very excited to have you on the podcast today. I know you and I have had a conversation prior to this, so this is our second wonderful chance to chat. And I was really excited to have you on this podcast because one of the kind of roles that we haven't quite covered is, communications, marketing, storytelling. How is that a component of the climate, solutions world? And I think maybe when folks are thinking about energy sustainability and climate, they're thinking, this is a really technical space. This is an engineering, challenge, for lack of a better term. And, what am I as someone who's doing PR for a CPG brand or, really any other kind of product or service? How is my skill set applicable to, the climate fight? So, was hoping to kind of speak with you about that today, and I know I learned a lot the last time. So maybe we could just start by kind of introducing yourself and what you do today, and then we'll kind of move backward.
Sure, absolutely. It's a pleasure to be here. My name is Julie Smith Galvin, and I own my own company, very niche strategic communications company called Green Path Strategies.
Wonderful, wonderful. And I know this has been a long journey. You've been in this space for a long, long time, and not to date you or anything, but you've had a lot of wonderful experience in this field. So I was wondering if you could maybe start at the beginning and maybe even paint a picture of what that kind of climate environmental world looked like at the time when you first started doing this work.
So I'll date myself. I started in environments, and I don't even think back then we would have even said climate.
Right.
Um, I, I, when I finished my undergraduate, I went to American University in Washington, D.C., and I studied international studies. And I actually got a degree in public communications, not because I ever thought I would do communications, but because I liked writing and I had some extra time and credits. And so I just
Yeah.
threw a communications degree on and really never thought that I would use it. And then so that was around 1990. And then I took off for the Peace Corps. I had always known I wanted to go into the Peace Corps. And I was assigned to the Dominican Republic, and ended up living there with Peace Corps for a little over 2 years with the training, and stayed after as well on my own to continue working. But while I was there as a volunteer, living along the Haitian Dominican border, the
Hmm.
northwest border,
Hmm.
in an area that had no electricity, had no running water,
Yeah.
had no transportation other than a pickup truck that would kind of come through the dirt road about once a day, maybe.
Yeah.
Um, I was actually just walking to the next town, the next campo, and an American on a motorcycle drove by, of all things. Didn't see many people at all, and you certainly didn't see Americans. And it turned out that he was there doing solar energy work. He was
Oh,
working with
wow.
micro entrepreneurs to set up their own businesses, installing 50-watt solar panels. 50-watt, right? I mean, we don't even talk
Wow. Yeah.
solar panels, and he was working with a nonprofit that actually I was affiliated with through Peace Corps on microfinancing. And so he and I became fast friends, and I really spent the rest of my service working on solar energy with these micro entrepreneurs, primarily installing. I went to a training class that his
Yeah.
organization was giving, so learned how to install, spent a lot of time on roofs installing 50-watt. I had a 10-watt solar panel on my little house that I installed. Um, and then when I finished my service, he was actually going to replicate the program. It was called Solar Based Rural Electrification. It was started by a real pioneer in the industry named Richard Hansen. The
Hmm.
organization was Enersol. He went on to form a commercial entity as well called Solus that is still operating in Honduras and the Dominican Republic and has been a model for solar all over the world. He's very well
Cool.
known in off-grid solar world. And so when I finished my service, John, who was that motorcycle driver, went off to replicate the program in Honduras, and I took over the program in the Dominican Republic. So I stayed a number of extra years on my own,
Oh, cool.
in a town that did have electricity and did have running water. But so that was the beginning of my energy. I think I had always known I would try to go to Peace Corps and really figure out what industry I wanted to be in or what
Right.
area. And I
Right.
didn't know whether I'd end up in public health and I never considered energy until my first week there. Dominican Republic at that point had rolling blackouts
Right.
and not, I say rolling, but they were unscheduled blackouts. And so the first
Right.
thing I learned to say in Spanish was se fue la luz, there goes the lights. And
Yeah. Yeah.
electricity just became such a central part of existence there. And you know,
Yeah.
even the communities that had it, the cities that had it did not have reliable electricity. And then of course, a great deal of the countryside had none at all. And so it
Yeah.
just got into my bones and I never wanted to leave the electricity sector after that.
Interesting. Interesting. And the challenge you're working with there was really, if I'm reading it correctly, was about kind of access and reliability and not even maybe like people putting their solar panels on the US, concerned about climate, they want to cut their utility bill, totally different kind of end
It
user
was, yeah,
need.
there was no real environmental. It was a complete quality of life.
Yeah.
Because the people who didn't have any electricity, so the little town where I lived, Los Oeros and Villa Vasquez,
Hmm.
nobody had any electricity. And so they would, the more well-off families had car batteries, just
Hmm.
traditional car batteries that they would take, and again, it was 3 miles dirt road out. They would, take on the back of their own motorcycles or get on this pickup truck and recharge in the city that did have electricity sometimes,
Yeah. Yeah. Yeah.
and then bring it back and use the battery and it would draw down, and they would do that every
Yeah.
week or two. Other than that, it was all kerosene. All the lighting was kerosene. And so these solar panels really allowed maybe 4 or 5 light bulbs and um, recharging that same battery. So we really tried to keep it local. These were not fancy batteries that you kind of see
Right.
now. They were just traditional car batteries that we would connect the panel to, and rather than unplugging that battery and taking it to be recharged on the grid, it would be recharged by solar, and it would run a television for a few hours. And so, yeah, it was really all about quality of life, some economic opportunities,
Yeah.
students being able to study at night,
Right.
displacing, dirty kerosene. That
Yep.
was a health issue. So believe me, climate, I don't even think crossed anybody's mind at that point.
That's fascinating. And did you
Yeah.
have to explain the technology? Was that a communications challenge at the time or?
It was in certain areas.
Yeah.
And we would very much use, not unlike we would do in any new technology today, yeah, demonstration.
Hmm.
So, try to find an influencer in the communities, and put one up and show how people came around. And there is nothing in the world like turning on a light for the first time. I mean,
Yeah.
some of these kids had never really seen light bulbs, or just walking into and turning on a light, or having dinner with lights. So a lot of it was just demonstration. But I
Yeah.
remember being in community meetings where people would say, are you taking the sun? Like, are we draining the sun? Right.
Yeah.
I mean, it was
Yeah.
just, there was a lot of, it was a very new tech. This is 91 to 93. I was in Peace Corps.
Right.
It was very new. But the proof was in the pudding, right? The proof was in
Yeah.
showing it. Yeah.
Yeah. Interesting. And just for my own curiosity, I'm curious what your just either on your own skills or career, like what was your or just life in general, what
Yeah.
was your kind of big takeaways from your Peace Corps experience?
Um, that I always say, people down there, the volunteers would say, this is not real life. And I would say, this is real life. This is how most of the world lives.
Yeah.
Um, it was humbling. It was interesting because as we were putting in solar panels, and frankly, a lot of people wanted the solar panels, not just for the lights, but for the television. And there was a
Right.
little bit of this, like, oh, we're pushing our technology on them, where we are spoiling them with television. And I was very much like, who are we to say?
Right.
Really? Like, everybody
Right.
in the world deserves to have the basics.
Yeah.
It's just like we don't tell people how to spend their money, and we should give people the services that allow them to have the quality of life that they choose.
Yeah.
So it was a wonderful experience. It was hard. I think the logo at the time was the toughest job you'll ever love. And it was hard. It was isolating. Um, Yeah, but it was very fulfilling. And I always recommend to everybody to do it. And when people say I'm too old, I say, no, you're not.
Yeah.
We had people in my cohort that were in their 60s, 70s, 80s. So
Oh, wild.
yeah,
Very cool.
yeah.
Very cool. So what then, what was the decision point to move on from the Dominican?
So like I said, I stayed 2 years doing my service, and then I stayed about another 2 years working for this Enersol, this nonprofit organization, and did some great work in the Dominican Republic and in Haiti, actually, as well. It was right after Haiti had had all those political problems, and went in on
Yep.
some Department of Energy tours there. But I think it was time to come back to the United States. And Enersol was based in Somerville, Massachusetts, and the founder asked me to come up and work on fundraising and be their assistant director. And so I moved to Boston area. I grew up in the DC area.
Hmm.
So when I was ready to leave the Dominican Republic, I moved up here to Somerville initially, and have recently come full circle because now my office is in Somerville. So
Yeah.
that was in
Interesting.
1995. So I came up, I continued to work for Enersol, did a lot of fundraising. At that time, it was a very different renewables world. It was very foundation driven, very government funded. It was
Hmm.
renewables really were not yet considered mainstream.
Right.
There were a few companies doing it, but it was really still very much a philanthropic and government driven industry. But I saw that changing. I think we all saw that changing. I think we all knew that for this to go mainstream, it would really have to be much more, in the capitalist system, and
Yeah.
that we would have to push for it through corporate. So that's when I ended up at Boston University.
Oh,
Um,
interesting.
yeah, so after a couple of years at Enersol, I started my MBA part-time, and then quickly realized I loved doing my MBA and ended up going full-time I think the same in the predecessor to the program at Questrom that you're in. So at
Yeah.
that time there was a nonprofit program
Yep.
that I was in, and I started in it. I didn't finish in it, but it was a great program. And so I went to BU, and I really when I was at a conference once talking about Enersol's solar-based electrification work, and people were talking about the microfinancing, and there was all this talk of debt and equity, and I was honestly kind of baffled. And I was like, okay, nope, this needs to go mainstream, and I need to be able to talk the business talk. And so found myself at BU
Interesting.
doing my
Interesting. And
MBA.
were there, where I know it sounded like maybe you took your core courses, you got your debt and equity and all the other, business terms we all love to bandy around. And I'm curious, it sounded like you kind of also custom built a bit of an environmental curriculum for yourself there too.
I did. At that time, there was really, so this was 90, I guess I started my MBA in 98.
Yeah.
Um, and at that time, there really was not an environmental emphasis at all. I'm so
Right.
happy to see that there is now. Um, so I ended up, I really built my own. Any project that I had to do, I picked energy companies and environment companies. There was one professor there, Andy Hoffman, who's now in Michigan,
Hmm.
who did some of the very, very early work on climate. And so I studied under him and wrote a case study under
Oh,
him that is
cool.
still being used. I just got my $12
Cool.
gratuity or whatever.
There you go.
My
Gift that
like
keeps on
right.
giving.
It is like every year I get $12 for the molten metal case study that I wrote with him. Um, but I really had to kind of just tailor it myself. And now I know, I think that there's actually an energy, you can do kind of a double with energy, which I so would have done back then.
Yeah.
But yeah, so it was just a very different time. And then all my colleagues, we finished in 99, all my colleagues really went off into the .com world before it went bust. And
Mm,
people thought that I was crazy to go into the energy and utility world.
yeah.
But within 2 years, they were mostly out of a job, and energy's been pretty solid for me.
Yeah. So what was that first move or two after business school?
So I went to a company. I did lots of networking, like I'm sure business students are aware. I had a whole matrix of networking, and I ended up meeting a recruiter who I still stay in close touch with, and I was way too junior for him to place me, but he listened to my story and I networked with him, and he was recruiting for a company called Energía Global International, which was one of the very first companies doing private power in Central America, in Costa Rica, actually.
Oh, cool.
And so he got me an interview in there. And so I ended up going to, it was called EGI. It was founded by Rob Pratt, who now runs Greener U, universities, helping universities decarbonize. And so I worked building, I worked on their operations team. I wasn't on communications. I wasn't in, I guess I was in business essentially, but I was kind of the operations person, working with lots of engineers. I'll never forget during the interview, my boss, who's great, said, "But can you get along with engineers?" And I said, "I think I can." Right. So I've spent a lot of my life translating kind of engineers to real people. But yeah, so we worked on all kinds of public power, or not public power, independent power, IPP, independent power production. Very first ones built in Costa Rica, some hydropower, some wind, a lot of work in Guatemala, a lot of hydropower in Guatemala, El Salvador, and Chile. So that company, I was there a couple of years, and then they got bought by Enel Green Power, which, you know, a lot of things were consolidating. Enel had come in and bought a U.S. renewables company a few years earlier, maybe about a year earlier. And then they decided to buy an international company, and we were both kind of in the same Massachusetts area. And so Enel ended up buying both of those companies, and I went over to Enel probably around 2001 or so, and continued to work on Central America and South America for a while, until they really moved their South America back down to Costa Rica. They split it again, put all their Central America stuff down in Costa Rica. And I had the choice to either go to Costa Rica and work on the Latin America side or stay in the US. And I had 2 little kids, and I kind of, you know, I wish I had gone, but I stayed in the US. But it was a great opportunity. That's when I started moving into communications. They had a corporate affairs job open. And prior to that, I had done all the operations, but I was also doing a lot of carbon finance. So that was really kind of when the climate started to come in. It was the very first clean development mechanism projects under Kyoto. And so a lot of carbon. We did one of the very first CDM projects out of Guatemala. So working with the World Bank on carbon finance. And so when I left the Latin America group, I went over to the US, the North American group, and ran their corporate affairs. So all their internal and external communications and renewable energy certificate trading, I took over for them as well.
Interesting.
Yeah.
So I heard operations and finance, but how did you then get into communications from there?
I think it was just because I was a good communicator. I had never thought about corporate affairs. It helped that I had that public communications, again, that I never thought I would use. So I had the educational credentials. They knew that I was a good writer because I had been writing applications for grants and for this carbon financing. And just sometimes when you're in a small enough company, and Enel's a big company, but their North America wasn't that big, they asked me to take it, and I did. So, and I never really left communications after that. That job also included a lot of policy. So a lot of like working on the very first renewable portfolio standard regulations. So commenting on all that policy. So I did a lot of policy work as well, which really hones your communication skills, because you have to explain what you're doing to regulators and be convincing.
Yeah. Interesting. So what was then you're on the communications rocket. That's the journey since then. So I'm curious how your work has evolved and how you have seen kind of climate tech evolve in that time.
Yeah, it really has. So after I left Enel, I went to Brookfield. So very similar experience, kind of working with stakeholders and project developers and operations. It has really evolved. I mean, first of all, it's just taken off. I mean, if you had told me that we would be sitting here what year are we in? 2022, and everybody's talking about it. It's just, it's great. It's great, right? And we really
Yeah.
realize it.
Yeah.
But so certainly it's evolved from those philanthropic government days. It's still heavily, obviously, energy in general is heavily regulated. And so
Yeah.
it's still kind of finding this mix of businesses and marketing, but also aligning the policy environment to it. And then you have end users. I've really always been on more the wholesale B2B side of things.
Yeah.
But you have this whole, you have whole populations now electing it or demanding it. And so it's just really, it's really kind of weaving together all those things. And I mean, what we're finding now, particularly here in New England, is utilities and independent system operators who are running the grid and getting them comfortable with it. And just, there's so many different parties. I think we all
Yeah.
know it's the right thing to do. It's just really finding, finding how it all fits together. It's not very
Yeah.
articulate, but it's still a very complex area. And you also have the profit of getting off the fossils. We have a
Right.
lot of entrenched long-term assets that people don't want to let go of.
Yeah. Interesting. So I'm curious, given all that, what are I know you mentioned it's still a complex kind of fairly technical kind of environment in which
Yeah.
you're communicating, and what's the communications challenge now that is different from what it was when you first started at an NL in corporate affairs?
Um, so I guess, and part of my work is a little different now. So now with my own business, which I've had 6 years, I work with a lot of startups.
Yeah.
And so the startup world is very different than the Enel, Brookfield worlds, which
Mm-hmm.
are, very large corporations, very well capitalized. Um, so the communications challenges are having a technology with startups and new technologies. And I'm a big believer that we're going to need some new technologies if we're really going to get to net zero, that we
Yeah.
can't just do it with what's already um, kind of feasibly and commercial. Right now is
Sure.
commercial. And so it's translating these technologies and showing that there's a market for them, that they can fit into regulatory environments,
Mm.
that they deserve recognition under renewable portfolio standards. It's really just demonstrating why they matter,
Yeah.
and how they're going to scale.
Yeah. Is there a particular kind of technology that's like a good kind of example we could learn from?
Um, I think, I mean, there's some really interesting technologies out there. So geothermal,
Hmm.
again, not a new technology, but there's a lot of new exciting things happening with it. So I have a client named Eden Geotech,
Yeah.
which just won a large ARPA-E, which is the big federal funding programs for new technologies. They have a open every couple of years where people just share ideas, and they shared
Right.
their idea and they got funded $4 million of it. And they're going to use a new kind of fracking that's not for oil and gas, but fracking that can be done and maintain the geothermal potential
Mm.
of drilling. And so fairly small company, PhD student, still a PhD student out of MIT, just got this ARPA-E funding, and really now, how does he scale? How does he deal with IP issues? So intellectual property, and telling his story, but not telling too much so that other companies
Right.
kind of come in and get it.
Yeah.
Um, so it's really connecting it to something that everybody understands, but highlighting that there's something new and different, and then trying to
Mm.
build it. Um, and then there's lots of models for building it, licensing or doing it yourself, and there's all those kinds of things you have to take into consideration. And these days you have social media, right? There wasn't social media back in my
Yeah.
early Enel days, and so everybody kind of wants that buzz and that chatter going on. But they're fairly complex issues. And so
Hmm.
it's really a balance between helping people understand it and not diminishing that there are complexities to getting
Mm.
this to getting this done. And of course, there's, and there's no, you have to be very careful about not greenwashing. I think people are much more aware these days of greenwashing.
Hmm.
So you really have to think about all of that.
Yeah, interesting. So I'm curious, um, for someone who is doing communications in another part of the universe, I don't know, they're at Tide selling laundry detergent is I don't know why that comes to mind, but that comes to mind.
We all need
There's people doing
laundry
this. We all
detergent.
need laundry detergent. And I was enamored with I bring it up because we had a marketing case and went through a whole pricing structure of and marketing program for laundry detergent in Brazil, and I was just something I'd never actually thought of how this works, and actually was shocked that I actually was thought it was compelling and interesting. So,
That's
um,
what makes business school fun.
yeah, totally. So on that note, so we got our friend over Marketing Tide. What is they care about climate, and I feel like I hear this a lot. People are, in their jobs, having success. They're increasingly aware of climate, and they are. I think a lot of people think of individual choices they can make and their
Yeah.
consumer choices, where they live, how much they fly, etc. If they're maybe a little more skin in the game, they're thinking about our kind of political structure and who's in government and what kind of decisions they're making. And then, but very few people are thinking, oh, I have a skill set that's maybe I could use, like maybe my job could be actually working on this issue. And I think especially something like, marketing communications, PR, might be one of those fields that people see, oh, this is again, this is an engineering challenge. And I know you've said
Yeah.
that there is a lot of complexity. We have both kind of technical and engineering complexity. We have regulatory complexity. Um, but I'm curious, like, what would you kind of, how would you paint that roadmap from CPG over to climate technology? What are they bringing with them that is day one they can walk in the door and start delivering value, and what do they kind of need to brush up on or kind of
Yep.
get up to speed on?
Yep. Um, I think that there's a lot of skills that can cross. I mean, the fundamentals of communications are the same regardless of what industry you're in. They're,
Yeah,
clear writing, understanding brand. If you have a design, if your bent is on design, making sure that you're consistent with that. If you know social media, it doesn't, the strategies are very similar, whether
yeah,
you're promoting Tide or a new climate concept. So, figure out what you're good at and what your skills are, and then how that can apply. So there are so many startups that just can't have an internal communications person, but they would love to have somebody come on and work on, particularly social media,
yeah,
or event planning. Now that we're going back into this event planning world, people are anxious to get out there, and but nobody quite knows how to do a hybrid. So if you come from an area where you're good at those kinds of things, like, just try to figure out how to make that connection.
yeah,
And so I really believe the fundamentals translate. Where I think it gets a little, and don't worry that you don't know everything. None of
yeah,
us know everything. And the complexity, like, you'll figure out what your niche is.
right,
And I've really just focused on clean energy my whole career, because now I can think in watts and megawatts, and but those kinds of things will come. But even before maybe you leave your job and do that and try to do some volunteer work. There's so many amazing activist organizations out there. I was at the Fix the Grid rally yesterday in Boston. You have Mothers Out Front, you have Massachusetts Climate Action, you have Environmental League of Massachusetts, and there are these kinds of things all over the country, and or
yeah,
just your community. So I do a lot of community work. I'm a counselor here in my hometown, and we have environmental sustainability committees and grassroots sustainability committees that we're always looking for somebody to help kind of run the communications around that. So get
right,
a little volunteer experience in the area that you want to do it. And then that translates into, you have solid communication skills, and now you have a little climate experience, and the two of
yeah,
those, given the market, for everybody right now, but there's people dying for people to work in climate right now. And
Right.
communications are important. It's not always the
Right.
first thing a company thinks they need, but once you show the value, you can show that you can be a profit center and not just a cost center.
Yeah. Fascinating. Interesting. And I'm curious, do you have any, do you feel that there's like any distinction in terms of the kinds of communication work that's happening? You said you've mostly done a lot of B2B work, but do you feel like there's that distinction that maybe someone, like, again, we're going to use our Tide
Yeah.
laundry detergent example, that there are B2C applications where, whether it's solar farms, rooftop solar, residential energy efficiency, electric vehicles, there's a lot of things that consumers do need to do like on an individual base to kind of contribute to climate action. And there are a lot of companies that are kind of trying to connect climate to a particular action that someone can take or a particular problem in their lives that a more climate friendly solution can address. And do you feel like that might be friendlier territory than some of the like regulated utility space? Yeah, I don't know.
Yeah, it very well could be. I mean, you have, just like I said with the startups, you have a lot of companies out there that are marketing products, that's where one of the main attributes, in addition to meeting maybe a fundamental need, is doing so in a climate friendly way.
Yeah.
And so absolutely. And I think in that case, it's really telling that story and making the connection. And that's kind of pure marketing, right?
Yeah.
That's getting somebody to buy
Right.
something. Um, and it's just, I think we still struggle in the United States with getting people to open up their wallets, is even as much as they believe in climate and environment. I mean,
Yeah.
it always ranks high on something you care about, but when it actually comes, and I think that's changing a lot, but
Yeah.
it's you really have to show value. You have to show the fundamental value of the product. I mean, okay, we're talking Tide. I just bought the these tablets for laundry detergent, and they don't dissolve, right?
Yeah. Yeah.
So it's great, and I don't want to be using all the plastic. And I was just thinking today, I'm like, I think I'm going to have to put it into a jar and let it dissolve before I put it into the washing machine.
Yeah. Yeah.
Right? Test the product. And then a lot of that is sales as well. I mean, when you're talking rooftops and EVs, you need to be able to understand it. I have an EV. Nissan has no idea what they're doing with the electric vehicles, right? Like,
Yeah. Yeah.
somebody needs to get to Nissan and figure out how to communicate, because they're selling these cars and people are buying that. And then I take it to Nissan to be serviced, and they ask me if I want the oil changed. They just have no idea. And so there's a lot of like mainstream companies that are trying to do this that have no, so don't just
Yeah.
look at the new companies, the new cool companies. Like, go to some of these dinosaurs and help them figure out how they're going to do the transition.
Yeah. Yeah. Interesting. That's such an interesting perspective. I love the oil change anecdote too. Oh man. Well, I think I'm at the end of my official questionnaire that I had wanted to kind of get through. I'm curious if there's other kind of areas that we didn't cover, questions you would have liked me to have asked that I didn't here.
Um, no, I guess I would just pick up on one string that you kind of pass. I think you're right about the voting,
Mm,
I think you're right about the kind of making personal changes, but don't underestimate the voting.
mm,
We really, there's a great group that's Boston based called Environmental Voter Project. If you
yeah,
don't know it, look it up. They are working hard to get environmental voters out across the country, particularly in states that are not always as friendly to climate action.
right.
And run for office if you're on, if you believe in climate, especially if you're in a town that's not, a Cambridge or a Concord or
Right.
a Boulder.
Yeah.
Run for office, and there's just, integrate this into every aspect of your life, because we are up against this. We're in a tough place right now. I'm scared.
Yeah. Yeah. Well, I appreciate that. And maybe to expand on that, could you kind of tell us a little bit about your position in politics and in government
Sure.
and kind of on really at the grassroots level doing that kind of work and both kind of what that work has looked like and what your kind of sense of the role of government in this kind of struggle generally, because I think that framing is also maybe a challenge for everyday people to kind of wrap their minds around what part of this is the responsibility of the government versus where is the private sector. And I know you spoke about incentives being aligned, but maybe there's something more
Yeah.
to add there.
Yeah. I mean, it's very hard. There are a lot of people who think that by just talking about personal responsibility, we're letting a lot of the systematic problems off the hook. And I agree to
Right.
some extent with that. I mean, you and I picking, using laundry tabs instead of laundry bottles is not going to solve it, whereas
Right.
Exxon in one day can make it a decision and really change the course of history.
Right.
But I think we all have to, so we can't be defeatist, right? And
Yeah.
just say, oh, well, Exxon's not changing, so I'm not going to change, or I'm not going to demand that Exxon changes. So I really found politics to be um, a good place to do that, a good place to kind of be in the middle where you have a little more say than just making a kind of a quiet daily decision, which is still important, but
Hmm.
not really kind of out there changing the world. So you're just changing it in your neighborhood. So
Yeah.
I ran for town council selectman in the town of Wakefield in 2018. I was one of the first candidates to really ever talk about environment in town. We are a fairly conservative town.
Yep.
Um, a high school student had actually put forth a bag reduction, a plastic bag reduction town warrant. We have town meetings, so everybody gets to vote on bylaws here, and had caused kind of all sorts of uproar, and it ended up passing. And made me realize that there's a lot of low hanging fruit in towns like these, that if there was a
Yeah.
voice on the board that could, say, well, maybe instead of selling off that tax title, we put it in conservation land, or
Mm.
we didn't have an environmental sustainability committee here, so nobody was looking at any decisions from an environmental standpoint, so we put one of those in place. And I'm really proud of the things we've gotten done here, composting and things that, just if somebody wasn't asking the question, nobody
Yeah.
knows to do it.
Yeah.
So you need people in all levels, at the individual, right? Our kids tell us to recycle. I heard
Yeah.
your last podcast, right? Recycling. So our
Yeah.
kids force us to recycle because they ask the parents, why don't you recycle? And when you have town councilors who say to the town, why don't we have composting? Right?
Right.
Just have to ask the question, and you don't always get the response you want. You don't
Right.
always, there's a lot of things competing for interest, and
Yeah.
clearly we have needs that are not just environmental, and I recognize that. But if you don't ask the question and be part of the equation, you'll never gain traction on this. So I really encourage people to get involved, in their local committees, in their local climate action networks. Our farmers market here is big, and people can just go out and volunteer there, and that
Yeah.
that has an impact.
Yeah.
So I don't know whether I answered your question, but
I think yeah, you did, and I'm
that's
curious
that's
too.
close to my, yeah.
Totally, totally. I'm curious, now we're hearing maybe about how divisive politics is at a lot of scales, but I'm curious, like, are you experiencing that in your little hemisphere, or are people still kind of what's the reality at the scale of government that you're working in?
I would say it's everywhere.
Yeah.
Towns are not immune from it. It's harder than ever to it's definitely difficult. I was ran for reelection last year, and there were very difficult questions and attacks
Yeah.
going on. But I think a lot of that is social media. People can hide
Yeah.
behind social media. I have to tell you, I've never had anybody say to my face or come to a meeting, or and I get along with all of my colleagues. We're a fairly large board. There's 7 of us. Do we always agree on everything? No, but everything is civil. And so I think if you just if you just look at what's in the newspapers, and particularly if you just pay attention to what people are saying on social media, it can be
Mm.
very, very negative and very, very discouraging.
Mm.
But I do hope that it doesn't discourage good people from stepping up and doing it. But it's not easy. It's a vulnerable place to be.
Yeah. Yeah, well, I appreciate that. Well, this has been just such an awesome conversation. So I just want to say thank you so much for donating some of your time to the cause
Oh,
here.
it's
And
my pleasure. It's so great to see all the Questrom MBAs out there moving the world
totally
forward.
try and maybe convince a few detergent marketeers to come on over.
Oh, I
I'm
think
probably
that's
gonna get a
great.
complaint from somebody about that, but
There's always somebody to complain. It's fine.
yeah, yeah. But
Yeah.
no, they're lovely people. We love them.
Yeah, and
So
look up, I mean, my information's online on Green Path Strategies. Happy to share my story anytime.
awesome. Well, thank you so much again, Julie.